接下来将交由中央研究化学研究所的许昭平博士担任本场主持人。
Next presentation will be moderated by Dr. Zhaoping Xu from the Institute of Chemistry, Academia Sinica.
让我们欢迎许博士。
Please join us in welcoming Dr. Xu.
Okay, thank you. It's my greatest pleasure and honor to tell you about our next speaker, Professor Paul Walton from University of York, United Kingdom. Paul obtained his PhD degree in 1990 from University of Nottingham, followed by 2 years as a NATO CERC postdoctoral fellow at University of California in Berkeley. He joined the Department of Chemistry at University of York as a faculty member since 1993. His main research area is bioinorganic chemistry, in which he has made contributions to the understanding of copper oxidases. Paul is the recipient of multiple international and national awards, including teaching awards, which I appreciate very much seeing them, the Royal Society of Chemistry and also from the Vice Chancellor of University of York. Paul's research has also been very highly recognized by multiple prestigious awards worldwide. But more importantly and more relevant to our today's conference is that Paul is an internationally known advocate for equality in sciences. For many years, Paul has been giving lectures widely on the subject of gender equality. His achievement in this direction has also been very much recognized through the Royal Society's inaugural ASEAN Prizes, WISN Man of the Year shortlist. Paul has also been serving as the chair of the Heads of Chemistry in the United Kingdom, chair of Royal Society's Diversity Committee. Paul was also named as Person of Influences by the University of Toronto's Women in Chemistry group, and is one of the Royal Society of Chemistry's 175 Faces of Chemistry. So without further ado, let's welcome Paul.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak at your conference. I'm very pleased to be here, albeit remotely. My name is Paul Walton. I'm from the University of York in the UK, and I've been talking about gender equality for the last 20 or so years, and particularly some of the efforts we've made in our department at the university to improve gender equality. Over those 20 years, I've had the privilege of giving something like 250 lectures around the world on the subject. I've, through that and through our own experiences at York, we've gained a lot of information and knowledge about how to achieve gender equality in an academic setting. And that's what I'd like to share with you today. I'm going to start with the slide that you see in front of you. For the chemists in the audience, then you'll probably know who this is, but this is a picture of the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier, who's sitting down at the table there. Antoine Lavoisier is known as the father of chemistry. And this particular painting is by the French artist David, very, very fine artist indeed. And many of David's pictures are real masterpieces. What's interesting about this picture, though, is that we find that Antoine Lavoisier, the person normally associated with the discovery of chemistry or the birth of chemistry, is not the subject of the picture. The subject of the picture is his wife, Marie Lavoisier, who you see standing there and looking towards the artist. What's more striking about this picture is if you look at Marie's arm, you can see that the arm connects with the cloth of the table, the red cloth on the table, and move down towards the glassware, really kind of indicating that Marie Lavoisier had a very strong role in the development of early chemistry, and perhaps a bigger role than we thought of in the first place. Many people think that David as an artist really was one of those artists who was prepared to show the truth, despite the fact that it may not be easily accepted at the time. And this picture really asks the question whether it wasn't Antoine Lavoisier who was the father of chemistry, but it was Marie Lavoisier, his wife, who really was the scientist and what you might call then the mother of chemistry, who really should have deserved the credit. Now, that's an interesting insight to this, and the picture, of course, may be misinterpreted or interpreted in different ways. But of course, if you look at the date, this was painted at the end of the 18th century. And at that time in revolutionary France, even if Marie Lavoisier was the scientist that was behind the birth of chemistry, she could not have received the credit. It would have been impossible. And so we get to this question: where are we now? We're in 2023. From 1788. Surely things have improved. Well, the next slide, if I can show it. The next slide, there we go, shows exactly this. This is a picture of the percentage of female academic staff, so female faculty, as a function of time as part of different parts of the world. So if you take each of these cluster of columns, let's take the one on the left as a start, which is the Arab world. Each of those columns represents a year. And as you move from left to right, you see the progression in the percentage of female staff, female faculty in that area of the world from 1960 up until 2017. And if you look at all the different regions of the world, we find that there indeed has been a very significant improvement in the involvement of women in our universities. So we take by country, for instance, the United Kingdom. We see that in 1960, we had about 15% female academic staff. And recent times that has grown to about 43, 44%. Sweden, one of the most progressive countries in the world, had a very high level to begin with, about 32, 33%, and that has grown to a similar number to the UK, actually about 42, 43%. Other areas of the world, like Japan, has a relatively low number of female staff in academic faculty, and the United States there on the right now has about 50-50. Now, of course, this is across all subjects, science, humanities, and arts. But what we see generally is there's been a great feminization of higher education, and things look good. So why are we still here talking about gender equity or gender inequity in our universities? What is the problem? Here are some data from a couple of years ago that were published in Nature Biotech. What was the study that was performed? In this study, researchers looked at people who graduated with a PhD in 1995. And then they charted or tracked the pay, the salary of those people for the following 20 or 25 years. On the right there, you see the salaries of men and women, where men are in the blue triangles and women in the red dots. And on the left, you see the same salaries of men and women, but in universities. What did the researchers find? They found that in industry, that men and women are paid basically the same amounts as they progress to the higher levels of employment. So 20 years after their PhD, you find that men and women are basically paid the same. Men are paid slightly more at the beginning, maybe, but industry seems to have got the pay rates of men and women pretty much equalized. On the left, however, we noticed two things. We noticed, first of all, that in academia or universities, we're paid less typically than in industry. But also we have this very unusual dynamic where men and women are paid equally at the beginning of their careers. But as we progress through the system, we find that men tend to be paid more than women. I should say in the paper, of course, the statistics were done, and this is a significant difference between what men are paid and what women are paid in universities. Now, we have to be careful here. The pay is an index which contains many, many different factors. Higher rates of pay, maybe different rates of promotion, different job allocations, you name it. The bottom line is, though, that universities seem to have this peculiar difference in the rates of pay of men and women compared to the rest of the world. And moreover, this only seems to appear in universities. So universities do have this problem. So it leads to this question: why do we in the academic body struggle? What's the evidence behind that? Well, the first thing to say is that we do have a problem with harassment. This was a paper published in Science in 2017, where surveys were done on scientists working in laboratories. And what we found that when these surveys are done correctly, so the right questions are asked about how men and women feel in research and in laboratories, then we find that the harassment rates the women report jump up to something like 50%. This is a real problem for science, particularly for laboratory-based scientists. The reason for this is that we find that there are many incidences of harassment which occur in laboratories late at night, where people are working together outside maybe the view of their colleagues. And harassment is a serious issue because if it goes on unchallenged or unchecked, it kills dead all other equality efforts. So the fact that we have such high rates of harassment in science and in science laboratories within universities means that if we don't deal with that, all our other efforts when it comes to gender equity will not make progress. And it really is the first thing to deal with. And we have a particular issue when it comes to late night work in laboratories. The second issue is this was published in Science some years back. And it was a study done by some researchers. What did they do? They went onto university campuses and they asked the following question. In which subject are the most brilliant people, the cleverest people? So they were asking questions for people who are like us today here at the conference, work at universities. So if you imagine that one of these researchers came up to you and said, in which subject are the most brilliant people, then you would need to pick a subject. Now you see on the right there some of the data, the x-axis going from left to right. The higher number there means that people thought people in those subjects were more brilliant. So for instance, if you look at the arts and humanities subjects at the bottom there, we say that the philosophers are the most brilliant people. And if you're a poor educationalist or a psychologist, then we find that we don't think very highly of you at all. Then we look at science and maths and engineering at the top. We think the mathematicians are the most brilliant people. And you can see that because they get a high score on the x-axis, the so-called expectations of brilliance. And if you're a poor neuroscientist or molecular biologist, then we find that we don't think very much of you at all. Now, of course, unfortunately, for the people who are being asked, what they didn't realize is the researchers were going to correlate this expectation of brilliance with the percentage of women which were in those subjects. And what they found was indeed there is a correlation between what we expect is brilliant and the typical gender of people in that subject. In other words, we carry a bias of brilliance which is against women when it comes to subjects, and this expectations of brilliance underlie many of our many of our mistakes when it comes to judging the value of men and women when you're contributing to academia, and this bias is very difficult to deal with. So the question is, am I biased? Do we all carry biases? Well, the answer is yes. The question is, are we prepared to challenge those biases and deal with them? Let me give you an example here. This is a plot of the average pay differential of men and women in British universities. And what is this? This is the average salary of a female, subtract the average salary of a male in an institution, divided by the average salary of a male. And each of the columns that you see is a separate university. So my university there, the University of York, has a pay differential disadvantaging women by 15%. Each other line represents a different university. On the far right there, we see some liberal arts colleges in London where actually women seem to be paid more than men. But then we see, by and large, that the average salary of a female is less than the average salary of a man across British universities. So here's my question to you. Where do you think the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, Britain's most famous universities, lie on this plot? Do they have a high pay differential between men and women, or do they have a low pay differential? Now, when I ask this question, usually people say, well, yes, you'd expect them to have a high pay differential, somewhere down maybe minus 20%. The truth of the matter is they're roughly where the University of York is. But what I'm really doing by this slide is saying to you, why do you think those universities, those very high-ranked universities, would have the highest pay differential? Do you too have an expectations of brilliance, and is that gendered? Here is a plot of data from ratemyprofessor.com. If you don't know ratemyprofessor.com, it's a US-based website, but where students are able to rate the teaching quality of their professors. On the bottom there is the score, a numeric number, a numeric value given to us, to the scores given by those students. The blue dots are the average scores given to men. The orange dots are the average scores given to female professors. And we see that for each subject, students rate the teaching abilities of their male professors much higher than they do of their female professors. And these scores are important because, like many universities that that look to promote people, students' comments on teaching ability often are part of the promotion package. And it's very rare that universities correct for the bias of their students when it comes to making promotion decisions. But of course, they should correct for the bias of their students because their students will be biased towards favoring men. And this is one of the examples where the ability to correct the data disadvantage that women face is an important factor. Here's a study that was published in Nature last year. It's one of the most influential studies I've ever seen when it comes to gender inequity in universities. What did the researchers do? They went into laboratories several years ago and looked at the fractions of men and women in any particular research group. And that's what you see on the x-axis. And then several years later, they looked at the publications of those groups and looked at the fraction of women who appeared as co-authors on the papers that came from those groups. And what did they find? They found for every single subject, at every career level, going from undergraduate to graduate to postdoc to faculty, that women were underrepresented on the publications that appeared in those from those research groups, without exception. In other words, women are doing much of the work that we find in research groups, but are not receiving much of the credit. And unfortunately, of course, when it comes to promotion or getting on in academic life, the number of papers on which you're a co-author is a major factor in the your progression chances. And you can see here that women are massively underrepresented by about 30% or so in the publications that come out of labs where they should expect more. And do we correct for that when we come to assessing people? The answer is no. It was a wet Sunday afternoon in 2012 that I was browsing through a chemistry journal called Angewandte Chemie. And I show you a picture of one of their publications here, or part of their publication, where they feature authors, very good authors, very good scientists, who have published in the journal or have been celebrated elsewhere. These are choices by the editorial team to celebrate scientists. You'll notice something here on the particular page I picked, that all of them are men. So I looked at this and thought, I wonder how many men over women the journal picks every year to feature, and whether this is a true representation of the balance of men and women in chemistry. So I took the full year's issues and I went through them and I counted up the number of men and women who were featured. And these are the author profiles you'll see here. And in total, there were 51 issues of the journal, and out of the 51 people who were featured, only 2 were women. only 2, a really low 3.9%. They also featured prize winners from other societies, and we found they featured 300 prize winners, and only 31 of those were women. In other words, overall, out of the 300 and so many scientists that they featured, that only 10% of them were featured were women. This is way lower than the actual number of women in faculty positions in chemistry worldwide. In other words, the journal is biased. Now, when I got these data, I decided to write a research paper, which I called Angewandte Sexism, maybe an unfortunate title, and I submitted it to Angewandte. This paper was rejected pretty quickly, and for reasons which are slightly difficult to understand. But perhaps the most surprising part of this was the response of the editor at the time, and I extract a little bit of his email to show you that. If we were to include more women, then we would have to have a different set of selection criteria for men and women. In other words, the editor accepted that maybe more women and men weren't being published in Angewandte and didn't want to ask the questions why that might be the case, or didn't believe that women could do the job as well as men. In either case, the journal was biased. And these are the types of issues that women face in academia that men don't, which then hinder their progress. And perhaps it's no surprise in seeing some of these data, some of these biases, that we see differences in the pay rates and promotion rates in academia. So how can we correct, and does it work? The first thing to say is there is a journey. When people are challenged with their biases, the following 4 things happen. First of all, people tend to deny they're biased. The second thing is then people tend to resist that bias. The third thing is they get tired of resisting that bias. And fourthly, then they finally accept the bias. These 4 processes are very interesting, not necessarily because of what they are, but because of the time it takes to get through them. A typical journey going from denial to resistance to fatigue to acceptance takes about 10 years. And it says the following. It says if we are going to change the way that we think about men and women in our academia, we have to expect a long journey. We have to be expecting to carry out things over a period of years before finally the community is prepared to move from denial all the way through to acceptance. And I would say this has been exactly our experience at York, and it's experience that you see elsewhere. This little pattern of behavior, denial, resistance, fatigue, acceptance, however, is also a very good measure of where you are, or you as an organization are, in dealing with gender bias. Are you in the denial stage, the early stage? Are you in the resistance phase? In other words, making progress, but it's hard. Are you in the fatigue stage where you have to keep on going, or are you finally at the acceptance stage? And by assessing where you are in this journey, you can then tell how much further you have to go. So if you're in denial, you probably have another 8 years to go. If you're in resistance, you probably have another 5 or 6 years to go. If you're in fatigue, you probably have another 2 or 3 years to go. If you're in acceptance, then you're almost there with a couple of years of work. What not to do? The first thing to tell you is that training against bias, so telling people that they're biased and then expecting them to correct, largely does not work. There's lots of data, and I've extracted this from a paper that was published a couple of years ago in Accounts of Chemical Research, referencing the studies which show that mandatory training, mandatory diversity training, just doesn't work and even can make things work. So if you work in universities where there is bias training, it is worth thinking about whether they're effective or not. So what does work? Well, what is known to help or counteract or actually enhance bias is shown on this slide. On the left are the things which make bias worse, and on the right, the things which make bias better. So if you start at the top on the left, if you're angry, or if you're frustrated, or you're anxious, or you've been drinking alcohol, or on the bottom one there, or you're under the influence of drugs, they're very likely to make your bias worse. If, however, on the right there, it's a funny situation, there's some humor, people are calm, or they're well rested, or they've had lots of sleep, or peculiarly if they're on some beta blocker drugs to control heart conditions, then we find that bias is much reduced. So it's worth knowing these factors when it comes to making decisions about human beings, whether it's for promotion purposes or when you're making assessments on papers or proposals, is if you're on the left there and you're tired, you're frustrated, you're angry, you're under alcohol, you're under the influence of alcohol, then you're likely to show bias. And you really should be in a situation on the right there before you start to make opinions on people. That is a really good way to counteract bias, but it's not enough. Here is some handwritten notes from me. You can't read them, but what do they represent? They represent the following situation where I, as a faculty member in chemistry, is sitting and watching the behavior of my colleagues as they're shortlisting for a faculty position in chemistry. And on the top row there where it says female, what I've done is I've listened to my colleagues and I've recorded and the number and type of positive comments they've made on the left and also the negative comments on the right. And I repeated that for the following male candidates, number of positive comments and number of negative comments. What we find generally when we do this is that male and female and I should say, sorry, this is an observer act. I'm contributing nothing to the selection procedures, simply observing my colleagues. And then at the end of those procedures, I feed back to help them in their final decision making. What do we find typically? We find that men and women receive equally the same number of positive comments, but men do not receive as many negative comments as women. Women often receive far more negative comments than men. Typically, when I reflect this back, just the number of positive and negative comments in total, the panel that's doing the selection is often surprised, but will ask me, where were most negative comments made? And I will direct the panel back to the candidates where more negative comments were made. Often, then, the panel will reassess those candidates, often women, and we'll see if they gave them a fair judgment or not. It's worth saying at this point that in many cases, some women who would not have made the shortlist were then put on a shortlist, and even then some were appointed eventually. So this act of unconscious bias observation is very powerful and actually has been the thing which has been the biggest and strongest intervention for us when it comes to counteracting bias, particularly in hiring and recruitment, and is something that I strongly commend to you. Another thing to be aware of is this is just a plot from a study which reflects basically the same story. On the bottom axis is the number of publications that people have, and on the y-axis is what you might call the quality of publications, the number of citations that those publications receive. And what do we find? We find that the number of publications from individuals is a poor, if zero predictor of the quality of those publications in the future. In other words, quantity is a weak predictor of quality. And it's well known in the social science world that quantity is typically a male-centric measure. So things like H-index or the number of publications or the size of grants or the number of prizes that a person has been awarded or the size of the grants that they've been awarded. All of these are male-centric measures and ones that we have to be very careful of when we're using to assess people. If you want to know more about these subjects, then there are two books I would recommend. These are the one on the left and the one in the middle. The one on the left, called An Inclusive Academy, was written by Abigail Stewart and Virginia Valian, two women who really were at the forefront of much of gender equality thinking in academia. And I need to say something here about the work that's been done in the social sciences on gender inequality has largely been done by women, and these women deserve a huge amount of credit in bringing us to this more modern understanding of, certainly of bias when it comes to its effects in academia. The nice thing about the book on the left is it goes through the evidence base for why we see certain effects, and then tells you what might be evidence-based interventions that you can bring to your own departments to make things better. So why should we do all this? What's the purpose? I hear many people saying, well, it's a good moral case to have gender equity, but why should we do it in academia? And answering that question up until about 7 or 8 years ago was very difficult because we did not have the evidence. However, the evidence is now emerging of why we should do this. This is a publication from Nature in 2018. It says the power of diversity, but it's the strapline which is important. Being inclusive gives team a competitive edge in science. It also happens to be the right thing to do. And really what I'm going to show on the next slide is why doing things together, research in diverse settings, really starts to pay off when it comes to the quality of work. So you see the reference of this work at the bottom there. 1 million research papers were looked at from across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, the English speaking countries. And the average year citation count of those papers was plotted on the y-axis. What the authors of the study did also was to look at the co-authors and give them an index of ethnic diversity, which is in the top left there, age diversity top right, gender diversity on the bottom left, and then affiliation diversity on the bottom right. And what did they find? They found that the performance of those papers was correlated with the research performance of those papers was correlated with the diversity of the authorship. This is no surprise, of course, because working in diverse teams or in diverse settings where people are recognized and rewarded is always associated with high levels of creativity and innovation. We find that actually the strongest correlation is with ethnic diversity, and that's not the subject of my talk today, but nonetheless, I raise it as an important factor. But we do find there's a strong correlation between gender diversity of co-authors, in other words, the teams, the research teams that have put those papers together, and then the citation count of those papers in later times. So the message is coming through now from all sorts of different studies that greater diversity, greater gender diversity is correlated with the performance, research performance of the teams where that diversity is. In other words, we do better academia. So why should we do better gender diversity? We should do it because it gives us better productivity, it gives us higher quality results, it makes us better academics. So I'll finish now and talk about some of our experiences in the chemistry department at York, where we've been doing gender equality work for the last 25 years or so. Here's some data which shows the percentage of female staff at various different grades at various different times. The light blue columns in the year 2000 showed that we had, at the time, very few female staff in the department. About 10% of assistant professors were female, and then very low percentages of associate professors, which we call senior lecturers, or full professors were women. Clearly that situation was unacceptable. You'll notice that after a lot of effort, the dark blue columns show that we managed to increase the percentage of women in the department quite significantly to almost half of assistant professors are female, about a third of associate, and then about a quarter were full professors. But you notice also that there's still a decline from the junior to the senior grades. And it took us then up until recent times, now we're looking at the white columns, so that, to show that we do actually now have equal progression of men and women through the academic ranks from the junior grades assistant professors to the full professor senior grades. And of course, it's entirely in line with the evidence base, which tells you the following, that if you're going to counteract bias, it's going to take you several numbers of years, possibly up to 10 years, to counteract that bias. And then you have to have that non-bias or less bias system then work its way through the system. And so despite the fact it's taken us 20 years, it shows you that one, it can be done, but two, it does take time to do. Lastly here, I'd like to show you the following. If we're right, if improving gender equality in the department is associated with research outputs increasing their quality, we should be able to measure that. Now, fortunately in the UK, each academic department is assessed for the quality of its research once every 7 or 8 years. It's called the REF exercise, and it's done by the British government. And they come in and look at a subset of your research papers and give them the following, each of them the following score. 1 star means it's nationally renowned. 2 star means it's nationally leading. 3 star means it's internationally renowned. And 4 star means it's world leading. And you notice I put an arrow there to show the 4 star. You'll see that we've had these exercises in 2008, 2014, and 2022. In 2008, you can see the pale blue columns there. We had about 10% of nationally leading work, about 60% of internationally renowned work, and about 20% of world leading work in our publications. What's world leading? Publications, Nature, Science, Journal of American Chemical Society, some of those Nature X journals, that type of output. In 2014, we had less nationally leading work and more internationally renowned work and a little bit more world leading work. We noticed in 2022, those numbers shifted significantly, entirely in line with the social science evidence that as we improve gender equality, we should see large increases in our research performance output. And that's exactly what we saw. So in 2022, last year, we have very little of our publications that were nationally leading. A third of our papers were internationally renowned, and then 2/3 of our papers were classified as world leading, entirely in line with the social science evidence that pursuing gender equality actively will then lead to better outputs, research outputs. If I look back now over the last 20 years, what's the journey we've been on? I would say in the first few years, people were saying, well, there's no problem. Why are you worried about this? Why should we worry about it? The answer to that response was to show people the data to show that there was a problem. Then people say, well, actually, it's a woman's problem, Paul. Women choose to have babies. Women don't do as much high quality research. Women don't generate as many publications. Then we had to tackle bias, and all the things I talk about bias in my talk, we had to deal with. Then people say, well, why should we worry about it? Yes, I can see it's a problem, and I can see it's a problem of bias, but why should we deal with it? I've shown you data to tell you exactly why we should worry about it, because if we don't, then we won't be as competitive as people who do worry about it and do make changes. And then the last resistance is a modern resistance, people saying it's all gone too far. Men have rights too. And now this is a very interesting resistance, and I would say we're in this resistance now. People are saying it's going too far. And we'll see how that materializes in the next few years. But that particular type of, that last reaction is a modern reaction to more and more equality work. You might want to think about all of these resistances and think about where you are as a kind of organization. Are you at the stage where you think there's no problem? Are you at the stage where you think it's a woman's problem? Are you at the stage where you don't think it's a problem to worry about? Or are you at the stage where people are saying it's all gone too far? On the last point, I'll just say this. The work coming from the social sciences now will allow us to quantify what corrections should be made for disadvantage. In other words, how many publications might you expect less from a female researcher compared to a male researcher in the same situation? How much less would the teaching scores be for a female professor compared to a male professor for the same quality of effort? So when people say it's all gone too far, they may be right in some instances, but they're going to be likely wrong in most instances. Moreover, we can measure the disadvantage and then say, well, this is the expected disadvantage, and then this is the expected correction we should make. So what's the recipe? This is the final slide. Share data widely and openly. Have leaders who are prepared to drive through gender equality and make it part of an organization. Yes, have high research expectations. Most importantly, learn the social science research. Go and find the books and the references I've mentioned there and read about the evidence base. Fifthly, be patient. Take your time. This takes a while to get through. And then lastly, keep the discussion alive. Make it an important feature of any part of what you're doing. That combination of things is the one that we followed and the one that I know will be able to deliver big changes in gender equality. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, very, I'm speechless. Okay. Yeah, very touching talk. So I see some questions running up. So please, again, you can use the QR code. So we can see, but within academia, why have funding differences not diminished? I can see the frustration behind this question. Paul, can you say a few words? Maybe you also seen through this before.
Thanks, Cherry. So for the first question, why have funding differences not diminished? They have diminished, but only in certain areas. In our own institution, the funding differences between men and women, or salary differences, have diminished to zero. There is no difference. And the study that I showed, of course, is one that is representing a system which is 25 years of study, and that we have to reverse that, and it will take time. But for those places which are actively managing gender equality or inequality, then the differences start to reduce.
Yeah, I think we still need more data and more convincing words coming out from our community to our system too.
Yeah.
The next one is the right of women to educate and employment has been achieved over the past few centuries. How long do you think it would take to reach the true equality?
This is a very interesting question. There have been studies in academia asking the same question. How long will it take us to reach true equality? So 50-50 male-female faculty, for instance. Most studies would suggest something like 50 to 100 years in the future. We will eventually reach equality in academia. Some subjects are predicted to take a long time. Other subjects are predicted to take less time.
Right. I think that's also what the book Why So Slow that you recommended. Yeah, what is asking, right? So the next one is, oh yeah, it is hard to push, but when our high-level leaders don't worry so much about it. It's not a question, it's more like a comment. Well, maybe the question behind is, so what do we do, right? If people are still here listening to you, what do we do?
This is a good question. Yes, you need leadership. Of course, you need leadership, and high-level leaders need to be concerned about it. If they're not, then maybe they should be shown the data to show that if they are not concerned about it, the institution will start to lose its competitive advantage. But my answer is a little bit more sophisticated, because who are the leaders who can really make a change in an organization? It is probably not the leaders at the very top of the organization, but the people in the middle of the organization, the middle managers, the heads of academic departments, the chairs of research groupings. It is these people who really are what we call the change agents, and are able to make a change in the body of people rather than the leadership. So my question should be, is it the people who can make a change those are the people that should worry about it.
People who can make a change. I see. Not really, sometimes not really identical to the administrative leaders. I see one coming up with 2 votes. Okay, historically, much of the gender gap in earning could be explained by differences in education and occupational choices. Again, this is not a question. Can we guess what's behind?
Well, it's not a question. It's a very interesting statement, though, and I think reflects the following: is that the gender gap in earnings is a reflection of many different factors, including the one that's in the statement there. It leads to a deeper question, and that is, why do men and women seemingly have different choices in, say, occupation or in education? Well, most of the research would say that comes from bias. Is that already girls and already boys are choosing subjects which is of the influence of bias. And once you remove the bias, then we start to see much more even or equal choices between education and occupations.
So I hope the person behind this statement is also satisfied. So what do you recommend we do to make men understand that women's problems are problems for men too? What do you remember us to do?
Well, as with any human being, whether men or women, they're persuaded by usually 2 things. One is an understanding, an intellectual understanding. So seeing the data, seeing the arguments, seeing the reasoning. And I've given some of that for you today, and perhaps collecting the data and presenting the data on men and women progression is the starting point. But also men need to understand what you might call the emotional side of gender inequality. And this comes through discussion and experience within our places of work. And it's those 2 facts together, an understanding and an emotional engagement, which is known to bring together more people, men and women, to tackle the problem.
True. I think there'll still be some way to go, though, because whenever we have such gathering, a lot of time men will just totally escape from us. So,
Yes.
from our invitation, right? So anyway, I'm curious about any experience that a man accepted that he was biased after debate and with you, and he did a change. Oh, have you ever gone
Yes.
through this, or with your friends or whatever? Yeah.
Yes, and both men and women can accept, after they've heard the evidence, accept that they're biased, and it has led to some changes. It has been hard to change in some cases before, because correcting for bias is very difficult to do. But by raising awareness, people have been prepared to tackle it. And certainly a lot of my male colleagues are much more aware and are working to correct their own biases because we have made it an important factor of our institution.
They are very lucky to have you as colleague too. I think so. Yeah, I think so. I cannot even convince too many people though. So I would agree with Paul. The issue is middle managers, semi-industry. Is there any research or any other case studies how to change their views?
I would thank you for the question. I would direct you to the books that I showed in my talk, particularly An Inclusive Academy, where the evidence base is laid out about what you might call the principal change agents.
Yeah, I think that we should go through the book and then try to make small talks. You know, we can maybe show some data one slide at a time, and maybe eventually they will be able to listen to us. Yeah, that's on my reading list too. Yeah. And then, oh yeah, Claudia Goldin wins Nobel Economic Prize for work on gender gap. Goldin does not offer solutions. Do you think this is mission impossible?
No, I don't think it's mission impossible. Largely because our experience here at York has shown that change is possible. And we now have a lot of data to show that is possible within a large academic institution. Also, the data show that things are improving. The question is not so much whether they're improving, the question is the rate at which they're improving, and it's too slow at the moment.
I see. So there are still a lot to look forward to, and we don't need to be too sad about it.
No, don't be too sad.
So, right? Okay, a few questions coming up too, like right of woman. Oh, that one we talked about. What can be considered as the starting point of the 4-stage movement, considering it takes 10 years? Are we started yet? How do we know that? I mean, I'm interpreting that.
I think I understand the question, and that is to ask people what they think about gender equity, and if the answer is there is no problem, I don't see a problem, then you're not you're only starting. If people say, well, it's a woman's problem, they make choices, then you have just started. So ask the question and see the response.
I see. Yeah. And then funding, I mean, it jumps all the time, right? What do you recommend we do to maybe? I think this one we have gone over too, right? Oh no. Yes, we did. Any new question? I think it will jump out. Cool. It's hard to push when or hello. Oh, yeah. We did that one too. It's a very touched speech. I'm glad that wait, come in. I think people like your talk. I do too. I mean, yeah. And to the audience, I mean, I listened to Paul's talk. I'm sorry, 9 years ago already, 2014. And I still remember the kind of movement that really touched me, and that also drives me all the way. And now I become a part of this society and work here. So there was one question, if I can find it, we can talk about it. And I have another window coming up. It's a very touched speech. I'm really glad that a man in change truly cares about the disadvantage that women face. Well, that's a comment.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. That's very nice, but it reflects an important factor, doesn't it? That we need the involvement of both men and women to start to make a change, and that more men do need to get involved. They should realize that they're part of the solution as well as the problem.
Right. That's right. So we are doing really well. Is there anything more? I mean, given you see this kind of profile of the questions, you probably can see also where we are, how much more change can be done, maybe roughly later on by all of our efforts.
The questions are very good. I've heard very similar questions before, and so there's no surprise maybe. I think it would be interesting for the audience or people in the audience to ask the question to themselves as where in this journey are you? Are you at the stage where people are denying it's a problem? Are you at a stage where people think it's a woman's problem? Or are you at the stage where people are saying, we don't want to bother about it? And then once you've decided that, is then to decide what to do. So the question I'm reflecting back to is, where in this journey is your organization. And on the basis of that, what things then should you do to continue the journey?
So we asked the question that what I might expect my colleague would think.
Yes.
In these 4 questions, not just myself. I can also answer the 4 questions, but I can also try to answer the 4 questions for the people I'm working with, either in our department or in the same field where we review each other, we decide each other's fate. Yeah. Oh yes, what a professor can do to help in this journey? That's a new question coming up.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what a professor can do to help in this journey is to do what a professor does and to read about the evidence, is to find out what the facts are, find out what the research work shows, and then implement that in their own spheres of influence, in their own groups, in their own places of work. And notice my argument there is that we should use the evidence base and we should use our brains essentially to tackle the problem, what a professor should do.
Right. I totally agree. I think when we are sick, we follow doctor's order, and we know there is science behind it. And when I see too few, female colleagues, I always wonder, aren't we worried about it? I mean, talent is going to be our biggest problem because our birth rate is so low. And it's also a gender problem too. So, and then I was wondering, I was sometimes also surprised at how low people's attention has been. I'm even having trouble with very good friends of mine, including my own husband, trying to convince him that there is a problem. So, well, but I learned so much from you. And of course, new evidence coming up, and there are many, many more new literature to follow. And I'm pretty sure many of us will go on for and be ready for a change.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sulin, I'm handing the stage to you now. Yeah.
感谢保罗·沃尔顿教授的分享。
Thank you, Professor Walton, for your inspiring talk.